Come in and settle yourself somewhere warm, because tonight's story wants nothing from you but a little quiet and a willing heart. There is no danger in it, no gunfire waiting behind the next sentence, only the smell of bread and the sound of two small boys whispering something they should not have needed to whisper at all. So pull the blanket up, let your eyes close if they want to, and let the words carry you the rest of the way. The kitchen at the Colby Ranch smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke that morning, the way it had smelled every morning for the better part of 3 months, and Josephine Whitfield stood at the long pine table with flour to her wrists, humming a tune she did not remember learning. It was an old habit from a life that felt further away now than it should have, a life with a different kitchen and a different husband and a different kind of quiet, and she had carried the humming with her the way some women carried a locket. The stove ticked as it cooled from the first batch of biscuits. Outside the window, the Montana sky was doing the thing it did in late September, turning the wheat stubble the color of a coin left too long in the sun, and somewhere past the barn a rooster was making his opinions known to anyone who would listen. She was folding a clean cloth over the biscuits to keep them warm when she heard the small footsteps on the stairs, the uneven rhythm of a 6-year-old trying to be quiet and failing at every third step. Charlie appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, hair standing up on one side, and he did not say good morning. He came straight to her apron and pressed his face against it the way he had taken to doing since summer, and she set a floury hand on the back of his head without thinking. The gesture is natural now as breathing. Something's burning, he mumbled into her apron, and she laughed low and told him nothing was burning, that was only the good smell of things nearly ready. He looked up at her with the particular seriousness that only very young children and very old men seem to manage, and he did not smile back. It was the last morning, though he did not have the words for that yet, only the feeling of it sitting wrong in his stomach, the way a house feels different the day before someone leaves it for good. That is where we begin, with a kitchen that had learned to breathe again and did not yet know it was about to hold its breath instead. If this kind of evening is the sort you would like more of, warm and unhurried and easy on the heart, you might tap that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what town or state you are settling in from tonight. We do love watching how far these small kitchens travel. 3 months earlier, the Colby Ranch had not smelled of cinnamon at all. It had smelled of nothing much, which was its own kind of sorrow, because a house that smells of nothing is a house where no one has had the heart to cook. Nathaniel Colby had buried his wife Mary in the churchyard at Amber Hollow the previous February, after a fever took her quick and cruel in the space of 9 days. And in the 7 months since he had run the ranch the way a man runs on habit alone, up before the sun, out to the stock, back in only when the light gave out and his boys needed feeding. He fed them, but he did not feed them well, and old Gus Feeney, who had worked the Colby land since before Nathaniel himself was born, had taken to muttering that a man could not raise sons on burnt bacon and silence forever. It was Gus who first heard of Josie Whitfield, through the kind of chain of talk that moves through a territory faster than any letter. A widow from down near the Yellowstone country, whose husband had been thrown from a horse the previous autumn. A woman with no family left to speak of, and a steady enough hand that she had been cooking for the boarding house in the next town over, just to keep a roof and a meal to her name. Gus mentioned her to Nathaniel on a Tuesday. In the offhand way a man mentions something he has already decided matters, and by Thursday Nathaniel had ridden the 11 miles into town and asked her plainly, without much ceremony, whether she would consider a position as cook and housekeeper for a rancher and his 2 boys. She had looked at him a long moment before answering. He was a tall man gone a little gaunt with grief, hat in his hands rather than on his head, eyes the pale gray of a sky before rain, and he asked the question the way a man asks something he is embarrassed to need. Josie had learned enough about pride, her own and other people's, to recognize the shape of it. She told him she would come for a trial month, room and board in exchange for the cooking and the housework, and if it did not suit either of them, she would go on her way, with no hard feelings on either side. He had nodded and thanked her with a formality that made her want to laugh, though she did not. Because grief deserves its dignity even when it is being clumsy. Josie herself remembered that first ride out to the ranch more clearly than she remembered most things from that year. The way grief tends to blur ordinary days into a gray sameness while leaving one or two moments carved sharp and separate. She remembered the smell of sage along the road, dry and sharp in the late spring heat, and the way the ranch house had come into view slowly over a low rise. White paint gone dull and peeling in places, a porch that wanted mending, a barn standing solid and well-kept despite everything else showing the wear of a household run by one exhausted man. She remembered thinking, with the particular clarity of a woman who has already lost everything once and has stopped expecting much from the world, that the house looked the way she felt on the inside. Sound in its bones but sorely neglected on the surface, waiting for someone with the time and the will to tend it properly again. Nathaniel had shown her to a small room off the kitchen, plain but clean, and had stood in the doorway a moment too long before remembering himself and excusing himself to the barn, and Josie had unpacked her small trunk alone in the fading light. Folding her few dresses into the narrow dresser, setting her mother's rolling pin, the one possession from her old life she had refused to leave behind no matter how far she traveled, on the shelf above the washstand where she would see it first thing every morning. She had sat on the edge of the narrow bed afterward and allowed herself, for just a few minutes, the luxury of missing her late husband properly, the ache of it sharp and familiar, before rising to see about supper, because grief, she had learned by then, could be carried alongside work far better than it could be carried alone in an empty room. That first supper had been a quiet, awkward affair. 4 strangers at a table meant for a family. Nathaniel eating with his eyes mostly on his plate. Samuel watching her with open suspicion. Charlie hiding half behind his brother's chair and refusing to eat the stew she had made from what little the pantry offered. She had not pushed any of them. She had simply cleared the plates afterward, washed them in water heated on the stove, and gone to bed early, telling herself that a single supper proved nothing either way. That trust, like bread, could not be rushed no matter how badly a person wanted the rising to happen faster. The first week she was there, the boys would not speak to her. Samuel, who was 9 and old enough to remember his mother clearly, watched Josie from doorways with an expression that was not unkind so much as guarded, the look of a boy who has already learned that people can be taken away and does not intend to be surprised by it twice. Charlie, 3 years younger, hid behind his brother whenever Josie addressed him directly. Though she noticed he watched her hands while she worked, fascinated by the way flour moved and dough rose and butter went from hard to soft under warmth. She did not push either of them. Instead, she cooked, and she let the cooking do the talking her voice could not yet manage. She made bread every second day, the kind that filled the whole house with a smell like a held breath finally let out, and she left the heel of the first warm loaf on the table where small hands might find it without an audience to watch them take it. She made stew thick enough to stand a spoon in on the cold evenings, and she remembered, without being told, that Charlie would not eat carrots unless they were cut small enough to disappear into the gravy. A fact she gathered simply from watching what came back on his plate 3 nights running. It was Charlie who broke first, as the youngest often will. 2 weeks in, he wandered into the kitchen while she was rolling out dough for dumplings and asked her, in the blunt way of small children, whether she knew how to make the cookies with the sugar on top, the kind his mother used to make. Josie's hands went still for half a heartbeat before she told him she did not know his mother's recipe, but she knew a good many recipes for sugar cookies and would be glad to try if he wanted to help her measure. He climbed onto the stool beside her without another word. And that was, in its quiet way, the beginning of everything. There were setbacks in those early days, too. Small ones, the ordinary friction of strangers learning to share a roof. Josie burned the first batch of cornbread badly enough to set the whole kitchen smoking, unfamiliar, as she still was, with the particular temper of that stove, and Samuel had watched her fan the smoke out the door with an expression that told her plainly he had expected as much. She had laughed at herself that evening, ruefully, and told the boys over a supper of eggs and toasted bread instead that even her own mother had burned her share of suppers when she was learning a new kitchen. That a good cook was not one who never failed, but one who kept trying until the stove finally agreed to cooperate. Samuel had not laughed with her, not that first time. But she noticed he watched her more carefully after that, weighing her against whatever quiet standard he was keeping in his own private accounting, and something in his expression had softened by a fraction, the smallest possible degree. The kind of change a person might miss entirely if they were not paying close attention. Samuel took longer, as older children do, carrying more weight and more caution. But even Samuel could not entirely resist the pull of a kitchen that had come back to life. He began finding reasons to linger there in the evenings, ostensibly to read near the stove's warmth, though Josie noticed he read the same page of his primer for the better part of 20 minutes some nights, more interested in the sounds of her working than in the words in front of him. One evening in early June, when a sudden storm had kept them all inside longer than usual, he asked her, without looking up from his book, whether she had always known how to cook or whether someone had taught her. "My mother taught me," she told him, setting a plate of cornbread on the table between them, "and her mother taught her before that. And I expect somewhere back along the line there was a woman standing over a fire teaching her daughter the very first version of this same bread, and here we all are, still at it." Samuel considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. "Does it feel like she's still here," he asked, "when you cook the way she taught you?" It was not a question about his own mother, not exactly. Though Josie understood it was also entirely about his own mother. The way children's questions so often carry two meanings folded into one. She sat down across from him and told him the truth as best she knew it. That yes, it did feel that way sometimes, that cooking was one of the ways love kept living in a house after the person who first brought it there was gone. That every time she rolled dough the way her mother had shown her, some small piece of her mother was in the room again, watching, approving, occasionally scolding her for using too much salt. Samuel did not say anything else that night, but the next morning he was in the kitchen before Charlie, sitting at the table without being asked, watching Josie work with the same unguarded attention his brother had shown weeks before. From that day forward, the boys were hers in the particular way that children give themselves over entirely once they decide trust is safe to offer. And the house, slowly, room by room, began to smell like something worth coming home to again. Nathaniel noticed the change before he understood it. He noticed it first in small things, the way Charlie laughed now at supper instead of eating in the wary silence he had adopted since his mother's death, the way Samuel had stopped flinching when Nathaniel raised his voice even slightly, as though the boy had finally decided the house was steady enough to withstand ordinary noise again. He noticed the bread, God help him. He noticed the bread most of all, the way its smell greeted him at the door after a long day in the saddle and seemed to loosen something in his chest that had been clenched tight since February. He was not a man given to naming his feelings out loud, and for a long while he did not name this one either, telling himself only that the house ran smoother now, that the boys were better fed and better tempered, that hiring Josie had been a practical decision with practical results. It took him longer than it should have to admit that he had begun listening for her voice the way he used to listen for Mary's, that he found himself inventing small reasons to pass through the kitchen in the middle of the day, that the sight of her at the stove with her sleeves rolled and her hair coming loose from its pins had become, somewhere in the space of a season, the thing he most wanted to see at the end of a long day's work. He fought the feeling for longer than he should have, partly from grief, and partly from a bone-deep fear that he had no right to want anything good again so soon, as though wanting would be its own kind of betrayal of the woman in the churchyard. Some nights he lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, turning the fear over the way a man turns over a stone in his hand, and he would think of Mary, of the particular way she had laughed at her own jokes before anyone else had caught the humor in them, of the small chip in the blue mixing bowl she had used every Sunday for her biscuits, of 100 small details that made up the shape of a whole life, shared and then, without warning, taken away. He would think that surely a man who still remembered so much, so clearly, had no business feeling his chest go warm at the sound of another woman humming in his kitchen, and the thought would sit on him heavy enough to make sleep impossible for another hour or more. But grief, Josie had told the boys once without knowing Nathaniel overheard, is not a debt you pay off by refusing every good thing that comes after it. It is a companion you learn to walk beside, not a wall you build to keep the rest of your life out. He had stood in the hallway a long moment after hearing that, hat still in his hand from coming in off the range, and something in him had shifted the way a fence post shifts after a long winter of frost, not falling, but leaning, finally, toward the truth of things. By August, the ranch had become something neither Nathaniel nor Josie spoke of directly, but both of them, in their private hours, had begun to think of as home in a way it had not been since February. The evenings had a shape to them now, supper at the long table with all four of them talking over each other about the day, the boys' chores, and Nathaniel's cattle, and the small dramas of Josie's kitchen. A hen that had gotten into the flour barrel, a pie that had refused to set no matter how she coaxed it. After supper, Josie would often sit on the porch step, shelling peas or mending, while Nathaniel smoked his pipe nearby, not speaking much, simply occupying the same quiet the way two people do when silence between them has stopped being awkward and started being comfortable. It was on one of these evenings, in the gold slant light of late August, that Charlie climbed into Josie's lap uninvited, which had become a habit of his, and asked her outright whether she was going to stay forever. Josie had gone still, the way she did whenever the boys asked a question too large for an easy answer, and she told him gently that her arrangement with his father was for a while, and that while a while she was glad to be there for every day of it. Charlie had frowned at this answer with the particular displeasure of a child who has decided an answer is not good enough, and he had looked over at his father, who was watching the exchange from his chair with an expression Josie could not quite read. Something caught between longing and fear, and Charlie had said, with the blunt honesty only a 6-year-old can manage without malice, "Well, I think she should stay forever, don't you, Papa?" Nathaniel had not answered right away. He had looked at Josie over his son's head, and for one long moment something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. Something that felt dangerously close to a promise neither of them was ready to make out loud. Then he had cleared his throat and said only that it was getting on toward bedtime, and the moment had folded itself away, unspoken, though it did not disappear. It only waited, the way important things do, for the right hour to come around again. The turning point, if a season built from 100 small kindnesses can be said to have a single turning point, came during the wheat harvest in late July, when every hand on the ranch, hired and family alike, worked from before dawn until well past dark under a sun that seemed determined to test every one of them. Josie had risen even earlier than usual those weeks, baking before the heat of the day set in, and she had taken to carrying food out to the fields herself rather than waiting for the men to come in. Because a harvest crew worked better, she reasoned, if the good smell of dinner reached them on the wind an hour before the meal itself did. She would walk out across the stubbled ground with a basket over each arm, cold meat and bread, and a jug of switchel to cut the heat, and the sight of her coming across the field had become, without anyone quite deciding it should, the moment the whole crew looked forward to most in a long day of grinding labor. Gus took to calling her an angel of mercy, which made her laugh and blush in equal measure, and even the hired men who had only worked the ranch a season or two found themselves working a little harder, a little more cheerfully, knowing there would be a good meal and a kind word waiting at the end of the row. It was on one of those harvest evenings, the whole crew gathered at the long table set up outside under the cottonwoods because the kitchen itself could not hold so many, that something shifted between Nathaniel and Josie in a way both of them felt, though neither spoke of it that night. She had made a meal larger and finer than the occasion strictly required. Roast chicken and fresh peas and a peach cobbler made from fruit Gus had traded for at the mercantile, and the whole crew ate until they could not manage another bite, and afterward, as the light went long and gold and the men sat back with their coffee, Nathaniel had found himself watching Josie across the table, laughing at something Charlie had said. Flour still dusting one cheekbone from the day's baking, and he had felt something settle in his chest that was not merely gratitude anymore. It was, he understood with a kind of quiet alarm, the beginning of something he did not yet have the courage to name. She caught him watching, once, across the noise and clatter of the harvest table, and neither of them looked away right away the way strangers or mere employers and employees might have. They held the look a moment too long, long enough that Gus, sharp-eyed despite his years, noticed and said nothing, only smiled down into his coffee cup in the satisfied way of an old man who has seen a thing coming from a long way off and is glad to watch it finally arrive. There were smaller moments, too, threaded through those warming weeks, the kind that build a life the way a single stitch builds toward a whole quilt. There was the afternoon Nathaniel came in early from mending fence, his hands cut and bleeding from a stubborn length of wire that had snapped back on him faster than he could pull away. And he had come through the kitchen door, holding one hand cupped in the other, more embarrassed than hurt, muttering that it was nothing, only a scratch, a man's excuse for pain he had no intention of admitting to. Josie had not accepted the excuse for a moment. She had pulled a chair out from the table and pointed at it with the same firm patience she used on the boys when they tried to skip their chores, and Nathaniel, somewhat to his own surprise, had sat without further argument. She filled a basin with warm water from the stove and set it before him, and took his hand in both of hers, turning it gently toward the window light to see the full extent of the damage, 3 shallow gashes across the palm and one deeper cut along the base of his thumb that would want stitching if it did not close clean on its own. She worked without hurry, cleaning each cut with a cloth dipped in the warm water, her touch light enough not to add to the sting but sure enough that he trusted it completely. And the whole time she worked, she talked to him in a low, easy voice about nothing in particular. The bread, rising too fast in the heat. A hen that had wandered off and come back 3 days later with no explanation for where she had been, and Nathaniel found himself watching her face rather than his own hand, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way a loose strand of hair kept falling forward, and how she blew it away from her eyes without ever once losing the rhythm of her work. When she finished wrapping the worst of the cuts in clean strips of cloth, she held his bandaged hand a moment longer than the task strictly required, and looked up at him, and something passed between them in that small, silent pause, wordless and enormous, before she seemed to catch herself and released his hand a touch too quickly, busying herself with putting away the basin. Nathaniel sat there afterward turning his bandaged hand over in the lamplight long after she had gone back to her cooking, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a man in the smallest of moments rather than the largest, that he had not been touched with such tenderness since Mary had died, and that some frozen part of him, some part he had believed permanently shut against the world, had just quietly, without his permission, begun to thaw. There was the evening she taught Samuel to make her mother's dumplings, standing behind him with her hands over his, guiding the motion of rolling dough, and Nathaniel had watched from the doorway with an ache in his chest that was not grief at all, or not only grief, but something warmer and more frightening, a wanting he had almost forgotten the shape of. There was the night a September storm rolled in fast and mean, lightning cracking bright enough to throw the whole kitchen into sudden white relief, thunder enough to send Charlie crying from his bed and into the kitchen, where Josie was still finishing the dishes by lamplight. She had knelt right down on the kitchen floor to meet him at his own height, not caring that her skirts pooled in the spilled dishwater, and wrapped him in the quilt from the back of her own chair, and rocked him gently while the rain came hard against the windows, drumming a rhythm that seemed to want to outdo the thunder itself. She had sung to him then, low and unhurried, an old tune with no particular tune to speak of beyond the one memory had given it, and she kept singing long after his sobs had quieted into hiccups, and his hiccups into the slow, even breath of a child, finally settling toward sleep. Nathaniel had come down the hall at the sound of his son's crying, meaning to see to it himself, and had stopped short in the doorway at the sight that met him, Josie on the kitchen floor with Charlie wrapped against her shoulder, her voice low and steady beneath the storm, her whole body curved protectively around his son, the way a woman curves around something she has already decided, without ever saying so aloud, to love and keep safe for good. He had stood there a long while, unseen, listening to a voice singing his son back to calm, the lamplight catching the loose strands of her hair and the worn softness of the quilt in the small, complete world the two of them had made out of nothing more than a storm and a song. And he understood in that moment, with the clarity that sometimes only comes in the middle of the night, that he did not merely appreciate this woman, he loved her, plainly and completely, in a way that frightened him with its size. He might have told her then. He very nearly did, more than once, in the weeks that followed, the words rising in his throat on quiet evenings, only to be swallowed back down by the same old fear, that he had no right to this happiness, that the town would judge him for moving too quickly, that Josie herself, a woman still carrying her own grief, might not want what he was too afraid to offer plainly. And so the summer had turned to autumn with the words still unsaid, a debt of honesty accruing quietly between two people who had already, without ever naming it, built something that looked very much like a family. It was into this unspoken, waiting tenderness that Agnes Pruitt arrived, as she tended to arrive at most things in Amber Hollow, uninvited and armed with opinions. Mrs. Pruitt was not a cruel woman, and it does the story no favors to paint her as one. She was a widow herself, older than Josie by a good 20 years, deeply attached to the proprieties of a town still young enough to worry about what it looked like to outsiders, and entirely convinced that her meddling came from care rather than nosiness. She had watched Josie Whitfield settle into the Colby household with a growing unease that she mistook for concern. And on a Sunday in mid-September, following church services, she had drawn Josie aside on the steps of the little white chapel and spoken to her in the low, urgent voice of a woman delivering unwelcome news for the recipient's own good. "It is not my place to say," Mrs. Pruitt began, which is the way such conversations always begin, "but it is not my place to say, and yet I feel I must. For your own sake, dear, that folks have begun to talk about a young widow living under the roof of a widower with no chaperone and no ring between them, and however innocent the arrangement, you understand how it looks, and how it might look worse still if it goes on much longer." Josie had stood very still on the chapel steps, the autumn wind pulling at her shawl, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. She had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that this conversation was possible, even likely, the moment she had agreed to Nathaniel's arrangement, but she had let herself forget it in the warmth of the last 3 months. let herself believe that the goodness of the household she had helped build might be its own protection against gossip. Mrs. Pruitt's words reminded her, with the particular cruelty of well-meaning people, that goodness rarely protects anyone from talk. She had thanked Mrs. Pruitt for her honesty, because there was nothing else to say, and walked home the 11 miles in something close to a daze, the words repeating themselves with every step. Folks have begun to talk, however innocent the arrangement. You understand how it looks. She thought of Nathaniel's reputation in a town where he had to buy his seed and sell his cattle and stand each Sunday among these same watching neighbors for the rest of his natural life. And she thought of Samuel and Charlie, old enough soon to hear whispers of their own and understand exactly what they meant. And the more she walked, the more certain she became that whatever warmth had grown in that kitchen over the summer, however real it felt to her in the quiet hours, was not worth the cost of shame laid at that family's door on her account. She tried, walking, to imagine simply staying and letting the talk pass over her the way weather passes, but she had seen what small-town talk could do to a woman standing, once it took root, had watched it happen to others in the town she had come from. A reputation worn thin by whispers, until a woman could hardly walk into the mercantile without feeling every eye in the room measuring her. She did not want that weight settling onto Nathaniel's sons, not after everything they had already survived that year, and she told herself over and over on that long, dusty walk that love, if this feeling she carried for that quiet, grieving rancher could even be called by so bold a word, sometimes meant knowing when to step back rather than forward, and by the time she reached the ranch house, she had arrived at a conclusion that felt, in the moment, like the only decent thing left to do. If her presence was a burden on Nathaniel's reputation, on his standing in a town where he had to live and raise his sons and do business for the rest of his days, then the kindest thing she could do, the thing that repaid 3 months of unexpected shelter and unexpected joy, was to remove herself before that burden grew any heavier. She did not tell Nathaniel the reason. She told him only, 2 days later, in the flat voice of a woman keeping herself carefully composed, that her trial month had long since passed, that she had been meaning to speak with him about her plans, and that she had decided it was time she moved on, that she had heard of a position in Bozeman that suited her, and that she would take the Thursday stage. Nathaniel had gone very quiet at this news, quieter than she had ever seen him, and he had asked her, in a voice with something raw underneath it, whether she was unhappy in his household, whether the boys had done something to trouble her, whether he himself had failed her in some way he could not see. She had told him no, none of that, that it was only time, that a woman could not stay forever on another man's charity, words that felt like ash in her mouth even as she said them, because they were not the truth, and both of them, on some level, seemed to sense it. He had not pressed her further. He had nodded, jaw tight, and said only that he would see the wagon ready to take her into town on Thursday. And he had walked out to the barn and not come back inside until well after dark, and Josie had lain awake that night with her decision sitting in her chest like a stone, certain it was right and miserable regardless. The boys had known something was wrong before either adult said a word to them, the way children always do. They had watched Josie begin, quietly, to pack the small trunk she had arrived with, watched her fold her few dresses with a care that looked too much like finality, and Samuel, old enough now to read the shape of loss even when it wore a different face than death, had gone to Charlie's room the night before her departure and told him, in the grave whisper of a boy carrying news too heavy for his years, that Josie was leaving on the Thursday stage and that Papa was going to let her go. Charlie had cried, quietly, the way children cry when they sense that loud crying will not be allowed to fix anything, pressing his face into his pillow so the sound would not carry down the hall. and Samuel had climbed into bed beside him the way he had not done since they were both very small, and put an arm around his little brother's shoulders in clumsy imitation of the comfort Josie herself might have offered. They lay there a long while in the dark, the house creaking around them the way old houses do when the night turns cold, and Charlie asked, in a small, broken voice, whether Papa did not love Josie the way they loved her, and Samuel, who understood a good deal more of the world than his 9 years might suggest, told him that grown-ups loved plenty of things they were too scared to say out loud, and that being scared and not loving were two entirely different animals, easy enough to mix up if a person was only 6. "We have to tell Papa," Charlie had whispered at last, and Samuel, older and more cautious, had agreed, though he did not yet know what telling Papa would look like, or whether it would do any good at all. He lay awake long after Charlie's breathing had gone slow, and even beside him, turning the problem over the way he had seen his father turn over a stubborn piece of machinery, looking for the one part that, moved correctly, might set the whole mechanism right again. By the time the window had gone from black to the deep blue that comes an hour before dawn, he had decided that the one part was courage. Plain and simple, the kind grown-ups seemed to forget children were watching them for. Thursday morning arrived the color of weak tea, a thin gray light that promised more autumn than summer, and Josie rose before dawn to make one last breakfast for the household that had, however briefly, felt like her own. She made biscuits from the recipe she had taught Samuel, and cornbread the way Charlie liked it, and she moved through the familiar kitchen with the particular tenderness of someone touching something for what she believed to be the last time. Memorizing the weight of the good rolling pin in her hand, the exact creak of the third floorboard by the stove, the way the morning light came in gold and low through the east window and lit the flour dust hanging in the air like something almost holy. It was into this kitchen that Charlie wandered, hair mussed, face already solemn with a grief too large for his small body, and pressed himself against her apron the way he always did, and told her something was burning, though nothing was. And she had laughed the small automatic laugh of a woman holding herself together by routine alone, and told him nothing was burning, only the good smell of things nearly ready. He had looked up at her, and for a moment she thought he might say something about the trunk sitting packed by the door, about the stage due at 10 o'clock, about all of it. But he only asked, very quietly, whether he could have the first biscuit, and she had given it to him warm from the pan, and watched him carry it away with the particular seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. At breakfast, the table was quieter than it had been in months. Nathaniel sat at the head of it, unshaven, his coffee going cold in front of him untouched, watching Josie move between stove and table with an expression he could not quite master into anything resembling calm. Samuel ate without appetite, pushing his eggs around his plate, glancing at his father again and again with the particular impatience of a child waiting for an adult to finally say the obvious thing out loud. Charlie ate nothing at all, only sat with his biscuit clutched in both hands, uneaten, watching Josie with the wide, unblinking eyes of a boy trying to hold on to a picture he was afraid of losing. When the meal was done and the dishes cleared, Nathaniel went out to ready the wagon, because that, at least, was a task with clear instructions, and grief is often easier to bear when there is harness leather to check and a horse to hitch. Josie carried her small trunk to the porch and stood there a long moment in the cool morning air, looking out over the land that had become, briefly and completely, the whole shape of her happiness, the barn and the wheat stubble gone gold, and the mountains standing blue and distant beyond it all. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us tonight, and for letting this small ranch house and its stubborn, tender family settle in beside you for a while. If you found some comfort here, consider subscribing so we can bring you back to a warm kitchen again soon, and sleep well wherever you are.